Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we are plunging into one of history's really enduring, chilling mysteries, Jack the Ripper.
Still fascinating after all this time.
It really is. We've been trying for, what, over a century now? Trying to figure out who was behind those awful murders in Whitechapel back in 1888.
And the focus shifts, doesn't it? New theories, old suspects, revisited.
Exactly. And recently, there's been renewed attention on a name that was maybe a bit lesser known for a while, Francis Tumblety.
Ah, yes, the American quack doctor. His name definitely pops up in Ripper circles.
But it seems he's really come back into focus more recently.
That's right, mainly because of a specific piece of evidence that resurfaced, I think it was in the 1990s. It really put him back under the microscope. We're talking about the little child letter.
Okay, the little child letter. Let's unpack this a bit. Why is this letter such a big deal?
It was written way later, 1913, by John G. Littlechild. He was a former chief inspector at Scotland Yard.
Okay, so a figure with some authority.
Definitely. And crucially, during the Ripper murders in '88, he was head of the special branch. So he would have been, plugged into the investigation close to the people running it.
So this wasn't just some random person's opinion.
Not at all. This was someone senior looking back on the case. The letter was actually found much later, in 1993, in the papers of the journalist he wrote it to, George R. Sims. And finding it really sparked renewed interest in Tumblety.
Right. So what did Little Child actually say about Tumblety? This is the key part, isn't it?
It is. He names him quite clearly. Well, almost. He says, a Dr. T, an American quack named Tumblety, and he calls him, quote, a very likely suspect.
Very likely. Wow. Did he say why?
He mentioned a few things, that Tumblety visited London often, that the Yard had a large dossier on him already.
A dossier. So they knew about him before the murders.
Seems so. And Littlechild highlighted Tumblety's attitude towards women, described it as remarkable and bitter in the extreme.
Remarkable and bitter in the extreme. That certainly jumps out. Sounds like intense dislike.
It does. Littlechild also called him a psychopathia sexualis subject. That's with Littlechild spelling, Sycopathia.
Okay, so some kind of sexual deviation in the thinking of the time.
Exactly. Though Littlechild interestingly adds that Tumblety wasn't known as a sadist, which he felt the Ripper definitely was. It's tricky applying these old terms and ideas,
Absolutely. But still, this letter puts Tumblety firmly on the radar of a senior police figure looking back. So just to remind you, the listener, what's the core time frame we're dealing with here?
Right, the main period, the canonical 5 Ripper murders. That was August to November 1888, all in Whitechapel, London.
Got it. So that's the scene. Now let's talk more about Tumblety himself. Who was this guy? The sources paint a confusing picture. His early life seems a bit hazy.
Very hazy. We're not even sure where he was born. Maybe Canada, maybe Ireland.
Mm.
Sometime around 1833 is the best guess. We know the family ended up in Rochester, New York.
And the descriptions of him as a kid aren't great, are they?
No, not at all. One account calls him a dirty, awkward, ignorant, uncared for, good-for-nothing boy, utterly devoid of education. Pretty harsh.
Ouch. And he got into some dodgy stuff early on in Rochester.
Apparently, yeah. Peddling pornographic books on canal boats, working in a drugstore run by a Dr. Lispinard, who is described as doing medical business of a disreputable kind.
Interesting. That early connection to shady medicine.
It is. And then somehow he reinvents himself, leaves Rochester around 1850, and by 1854 he's this apparently wealthy Indian herb doctor.
Quite the transformation. Any idea where the money came from?
That's another mystery. The sources don't really explain the sudden wealth. It just sort of appears, which, adds to the intrigue.
Definitely. Now, this is where things get, frankly, quite bizarre. There's an anecdote from a Colonel C.S. Dunham about a dinner party.
Ah, yes, the Dunham story. It's quite something.
Tell us about it.
So Dunham claimed he was at a dinner where Tumblety just went off on this tirade against women, especially fallen women, prostitutes.
Okay, that fits the bitter description Little Child used.
It does. But then, according to Dunham, Tumblety took his guests to his office and showed them, jars.
Jars contained.
Supposedly, a dozen or more jars containing the matrices, uteri, of every class of women.
Yes.
Dunham even claimed nearly half a display case was filled with these specimens.
Whoa, that's incredibly gruesome, if it's true. Did Tumblety give a reason for this alleged hatred and collection?
Dunham said Tumblety claimed his wife had betrayed him, that he found out after marrying her that she'd been involved in prostitution, living in gloomy-looking houses, as the quote goes, and this supposed betrayal made him give up all womankind.
Okay, but how reliable is this Colonel Dunham? Because that story sounds almost too theatrical.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Dunham was later described as a known confidence trickster, and he only told this story after Tumblety became notorious as a Ripper suspect.
So he might have just been cashing in, making it up.
Very possibly. It's a huge red flag for the credibility of the story. And it really highlights a problem in Ripperology. You get these sensational accounts, maybe from unreliable sources, that get repeated and kind of take on a life of their own. You have to be so careful with the sources.
That's a really key point. Got to separate the potential facts from the lurid tales. But you can see why the uterus collection idea grabbed people's attention.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly macabre. And it pops up again in more recent online discussions, like on Reddit.
Right. You mentioned a Reddit user brought up similar points.
Yeah, someone summarized claims about the hatred of women, the uterus collection linking it to one victim missing a uterus, potential anatomical knowledge, maybe syphilis, adding a motive.
Syphilis? Where did that come from?
Just speculation from the user, suggesting it as another potential driver for anger or revenge. They also mentioned him visiting London a lot, knowing the area, maybe even dressing down to blend in, trying to fit him into a modern sort of profile.
Which is always tricky with historical cases, right? Applying modern ideas back then.
Exactly. Different times, different understandings. The user also mentioned other things. Tumblety wearing a similar hat to the Ripper descriptions, being tall, 6'2".
Which might actually be a point against him, given witness accounts.
Could be, yeah. Most witnesses describe someone more average. The Reddit post also mentions stalking behavior later in Rochester, a fake mustache, Irish origins maybe linking to the From Hell letter, and these 2 cheap brass rings found in his stuff after he died.
Rings? What's the connection?
One victim, Annie Chapman, was missing 2 rings. But, you know, Tumblety was supposedly wealthy. What'd he keep 2 cheap brass rings? Seems a bit thin.
Yeah, a lot of these points feel circumstantial at best, like the stalking years later.
Very weak, really. And the online articles we looked at push back against some of this, too.
What did they say?
Well, they emphasize that there's actually scant evidence he collected any medical specimens at all, directly contradicting Dunham.
Undermining that whole gruesome story. Exactly. Plus, they mentioned his New York landlady, Mrs. McNamara, who apparently described him as a perfect gentleman. Said she couldn't imagine him hurting anyone.
So, completely different perspectives on his character. Very conflicting.
Totally. Makes it hard to pin down who he really was.
Okay, let's shift focus to his time in London during the murders and his arrest. What do we know for sure?
We know he arrived back in England, in Liverpool, in June 1888, so he was definitely around.
And he was arrested in London?
Yes, on November 7th, 1888, right in the thick of things. But importantly, he wasn't arrested for the murders initially.
What was it for then?
The charge was gross indecency, essentially homosexual acts involving 4 other men.
Okay, so a morals charge, not murder at first.
Right, but then on November 12th, he was charged on suspicion of the Whitechapel murders.
So there was a gap between the 7th and the 12th.
Yes, and that gap is significant because Mary Kelly, the last canonical victim, was murdered on November 9th. So he was arrested, potentially released or just held, and then recharged after her murder.
That timing is interesting. What happened after he was charged with suspicion of the murders?
He was actually released on bail on November 16th. Quite high bail, apparently.
Released? Even though he was suspected of being the Ripper.
Seems strange, doesn't it? And then, predictably perhaps, he skipped bail on November 24th, fled the country.
Where'd he go?
To France first, using the alias Frank Townsend. Then he hopped on a ship to New York City.
And this is where Inspector Littlechild got it wrong in his letter, right? He thought Tumblety disappeared.
He did. Littlechild suggested Tumblety probably committed suicide after fleeing, but that was completely wrong. Tumblety lived for years in the U.S., had run-ins with the law there too.
Makes you wonder about the accuracy of Littlechild's memory, maybe, or just the fog of time.
Could be either. It's also really striking, as you mentioned earlier, how his arrest and escape were handled by the press.
Right, almost no coverage in the UK papers.
Virtually none. But the American papers, especially in New York, they were all over it. Big headlines.
Why the difference? Any theories?
One strong theory is that Scotland Yard might have wanted to keep it quiet. Imagine the embarrassment if the public found out their prime Ripper suspect had just slipped away on bail.
Yeah, that would look really bad, especially with the panic levels at the time. Makes sense they might try to hush it up.
Exactly. Damage control.
Okay, so we have this complex figure, present in London, arrested, flees.
Let's try and systematize this. What are the main arguments for Tumblety being Jack the Ripper?
Well, proponents point to several things. First, the profile, sort of. His alleged intense hatred of women, specifically prostitutes, fits the victimology. You have the supposed abortion story, the failed marriage story, the uterus collection rumor. It paints a picture.
Even if some of those stories are shaky.
Even so, they contribute to the narrative. Then there's his presence in London during the murder spree. Some argue he could have been the batty straight lodger, which would give him local knowledge.
Okay, what else?
His potential anatomical knowledge from his doctor background and maybe that drugstore work. Then his arrest during the Autumn of Terror, even if for something else initially, placed him on police radar.
And the timing of his flight.
That's a big one for the pro camp. The canonical murders stopped after he fled on November 24th. The coincidence is striking.
It really is. And you have Chief Inspector Littlechild himself calling him very likely.
Exactly. A high-ranking officer's opinion carries weight, even years later. Plus, Tumblety's history using aliases, disappearing acts, previous police attention.
And the fact that Scotland Yard apparently contacted U.S. police about him.
Yes, there was communication. Talk of a detective possibly being sent over shows they were interested, at least for a while. He evaded capture in New York initially. He had the money to travel, change appearance.
He sounds like quite a character. Eccentric, shrewd.
Definitely described that way. And apparently some people who knew him in America thought he could have been the Ripper. Plus, the argument that he was the baddie street lodger keeps coming up in some research.
Okay, that's a fairly long list of circumstantial points, isn't it?
It is, but then you have the counterarguments.
Let's hear them. What are the main reasons to doubt he was the Ripper?
Well, for starters, the chief inspector in New York, Burns, apparently dismissed the idea, said there was no proof, and the London charges weren't extraditable anyway.
So the authorities where he ended up weren't convinced.
Didn't seem to be. Then there's the physical description issue we touched on. Philip Sugden, a respected Ripper historian, points out Tumblety was 5'6" in 1888, older than most witnesses suggested.
And taller.
And taller, right. Significantly so, compared to descriptions of a more average man.
What about actual solid evidence connecting him to the crimes themselves?
That's the biggest weakness in the case against him. There just isn't any. No direct evidence, no witnesses putting him at the scenes, no forensics, nothing concrete linking him specifically to the murders.
It's all circumstantial, behavioral.
Pretty much. Then there's the modern profiling angle. Some argue his documented homosexuality makes it less likely he'd target female prostitutes.
Though Littlechild's view at the time was different, linking contrary sexual instinct to general cruelty.
Right, so it depends which lens you use. The Reddit user also rightly pointed out he wasn't linked to other violent crimes before or after. That Rochester stalking claim feels flimsy.
And the whole hating women thing could be interpreted differently?
Some suggest it might have been related to his homosexuality, a cover, or a complex reaction. And the organ collection, if it happened, could potentially be linked to his medical practice, maybe performing abortions, rather than just sadism.
And there's the timing of his arrest again?
Yes, being arrested for gross indecency just 2 days before Mary Kelly's murder. Would he really risk committing another even more high-profile crime right after being in police hands and released on bail? Seems incredibly risky. Maybe ludicrous, as one source put it.
It does seem like pushing your luck to an extreme degree.
And perhaps the most telling point against him, the police actions themselves.
Releasing him on bail, not extraditing him.
Exactly. If Scotland Yard truly believed he was Jack the Ripper, letting him post bail, and then not aggressively pursuing extradition when they knew he was in New York, it just doesn't add up. It suggests they didn't seriously consider him their man, despite Littlechild's later opinion.
That feels like a very strong counter-argument. Police inaction speaks volumes sometimes.
It really does.
We should probably quickly mention those other contemporary murder cases, the Pinchin Street torso, the Whitehall mystery. Any Tumblety link there?
No, not really. Those had different methods, dismemberment, mainly, and were generally attributed to a separate torso killer. Police at the time didn't connect them to the Ripper. Same with the Carrie Brown murder in New York in 1891. Initial comparisons were made, but the Met Police ruled out a connection.
Okay. And finally, briefly, where does the Aaron Kosminski DNA evidence fit in all this? Does it impact the Tumblety theory?
Well, it points suspicion strongly towards Kosminski for Catherine Eddowes' murder, based on DNA from a shawl supposedly found at the scene.
But there are issues with that evidence.
Yes. Significant debate surrounds the shawl's provenance. Can we be sure it's authentic and uncontaminated? And mitochondrial DNA, which was used, isn't as specific as nuclear DNA. It can exclude people, but definitively identifying someone is much harder. So while it adds weight to the Kosminski case, it doesn't definitively rule Tumblety or anyone else out. It's another piece in a very fragmented puzzle.
So after weighing all this, the little child letter, the bizarre stories, his presence, his flight, the lack of hard evidence, where do we land on Tumblety?
It's deeply frustrating, isn't it? The case for Tumblety is built on some really intriguing circumstantial points. Little child's opinion, the timing of the murder stopping, his known eccentricity and misogyny.
Yeah.
It paints a compelling picture of a potential suspect.
That
But the foundations are shaky. The lack of any direct evidence is a massive problem. The unreliability of key anecdotes like Dunham's, the physical discrepancies, his arrest for something else, the police not pursuing him harder, these all raise serious doubt.
It's the classic Ripper problem, isn't it? Lots of smoke, but proving where the fire is, impossible.
Exactly. There's no smoking gun. Ripperologists are still divided on him, and for good reason. The evidence pulls in different directions.
So we have to leave it there, unresolved. But here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Considering Tumblety's strangeness, his arrest, his flight coinciding with the end of the canonical murders, could the lack of solid evidence against him be down to, say, police fumbling the ball back then? Or maybe even deliberately looking away from an embarrassing suspect? Or do the inconsistencies, the lack of concrete proof, just mean he simply wasn't the Ripper?
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? We definitely encourage you to look into the sources yourself, weigh it all up. Tumblety remains one of the most fascinating and debatable figures in this whole enduring mystery.